Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to start with a new thinker in Western political thought, that is Hegel. And on Hegel again we are going to have 3 lectures. In the first lecture today we will discuss his brief historical, political and intellectual context, and also we look at the personal life of Hegel in the first part of the lecture today, and then we will move on to discuss his views on freedom. In the second lecture on Hegel, we will discuss his views on particularly state, civil society and family, and how he see it as a kind of unfolding of human or universal spirit. And in concluding lecture, that would be the third lecture on Hegel, we will particularly discuss his views on right or philosophy of right, and in the second part of that lecture on Hegel, we will discuss the critical assessment or the critical reflection on Hegelian philosophy, its influence in Western political thought. Let us start with his personal, political, intellectual context and also his views on freedom. You know, Hegel was part of a tradition of thought in continental or European philosophy, which we call German idealism. And this school of thought is something which has profound influence in continental philosophy or European philosophy, so to say. There was the kind of divide between, say, what is the ultimate reality? Is it the idea or the matter? And German idealism very decisively established the primacy of idea. And Hegel was the most influential thinker, or one can say the culmination of this school of thought we called German idealism. And he remains a very profound thinker of this school of thought, where one can see a kind of not just establishing the primacy of idea, but also in a very unique way transcending this difference between material and the ideal. So, it is the boundary, that division that we often make in our intellectual discussions about what is real, only material, only those things which we can perceive through our sense perception should be basis of the scientific knowledge, and things which are not possible to perceive through sense perceptions are something which we should not bother too much about. So, this differentiation between material and the ideal was somewhat getting transcended in the philosophy of Kant, Hegel and many other thinkers in German idealism. So, Hegel is one of the profound influential thinker of German idealism, and German idealism as a school of thought is associated with Immanuel Kant, the thinker we have discussed before Hegel, and how he Kant not only established the role of reason and rationality as the way forward to enlightenment for the individual, for the society as a whole, but also he profoundly and conclusively established the limits of human reason also, or human rationality and also, and then how one should still be guided by reason and rationality by following what he calls categorical imperative, and that is the basis of German idealism. Fichte, Schelling further developed this tradition of German idealism, and you can regard Hegel as the culmination of this philosophical tradition, who took it to the next level by providing it a much more historical and contextual form. In other words, the real substance to abstraction. So, in much of Kant's writing, there is great preference for abstraction. What is unique about Hegel's contribution to German idealism? He not only acknowledged the relevance or the significance of the particular and the material, but consider it as the basis of the realization of the abstract or the ethical or the universal. So, Hegel in a sense truly transcend that boundary between the real and the material, the particular and the universal, the contextual or the abstract. So, as we discuss further on his views on human freedom, family, civil society and state, his views on the history or unfolding of human spirit and so on, we come to know that how Hegel also acknowledged the historical context or the particular context as the necessary or a kind of prerequisite for the realization of human spirit or human freedom. So, in Hegel you do not have just a kind of abstract or the formal sense of understanding about human freedom, human reason and rationality, but also a kind of very historical contextual approach to understand some of these things. So, like Kant, he does not remain confined to the realm of abstract, but also acknowledging and then transcending the particular historical and the contextual existence of these things. So, Hegel, like other thinkers of German idealism, argued about the primacy of ideas in the march of history or human progress, and he saw it as a result of dialectics. And this point we will come to discuss when we discuss his views on freedom, but dialectics is basically this understanding of opposites and how the interaction of opposites constitute a reality, constitute the nature of the phenomena, and then the further development of that phenomena or further development of reality as the next stage of history is the movement of this struggle between the opposites and its reconciliation through a kind of synthesis. So, in popular terminology, one can understand this dialectics through the idea of thesis, antithesis and synthesis. So, the movement of history in a way is the human movement for progress. So, one stage of life leads to next stage of life, which is much more mature, much more progressive than the previous stage, and that is result of this struggle between the opposites, thesis and antithesis, and the contradiction between the two leads to the next stage of life, that is called synthesis, and again the next stage would be a result of further contradiction, which will lead further to the next stage of human history. So, in such movement of history through dialectics, Hegel gives primacy to ideas, and we will discuss when we look at the critical assessment of Hegel philosophy that how Marx and other materialist philosophers argue that it is not the idea, but the matter which or the material condition or the context which shapes human ideas, imagination and consciousness, and therefore play a decisive role in the human history through his idea on historical materialism and so on. But for Hegel, the primacy is that of ideas. So, the movement in history is the result of a struggle between the opposites, where the primary force in history is the ideas. So, Hegel's philosophy in a way combined these two strong tradition or intellectual tradition in Germany, which is that of German Romanticism and the Enlightenment tradition. So, while discussing Kant, we discussed that how Enlightenment thinker thought that the reason and rationality would be a way forward for the humanity or human progress or prosperity. In contrast to that, there are many thinkers such as Rousseau or Goethe and many other thinkers in German and European tradition who was arguing that human reasons has limits and it creates new challenges or new problems for the society. So, they were thinking about a kind of uncontaminated or a kind of honest simple life with the nature without much use of human reason or human rigorous inquiry into the reality and then transforming about the reality. So, the romantics basically was thinking about going back to the nature, going back to the stage of life where human life was simple, the association was based on mutual trust without driven by the clever calculation of instrumental rationality and so on. So, there was a very strong traction for this kind of romantic thoughts as well, and in Hegel's we find that how he also acknowledged the role of passion, desires, and yet established the solid role of human reason and rationality to guide human will or human freedom. So, in Hegel you find the combination of both these traditions, the German romantics and also Enlightenment tradition, and his conceptions of freedom, rights, or views on history, human progress, the relationship between master and slave and self and other, his views on family, civil society and state were profoundly shaped by his belief in the unfolding of universal spirit or mind, which he also called Geist, and he argued that every phenomenon on earth which is animate or inanimate is the manifestation of the same universal spirit or universal mind, and this universal mind or spirit is in constant motion. So, there is a kind of constant movement in the history of universal spirit or world spirit, and higher stage of the realization of such a spirit. So, human history in that sense is the constant forward movement of world spirit or human spirit, which is manifested in every sphere of life, and both animate or inanimate beings are part of that universal spirit. And human beings as individuals, according to Hegel, also carry such a spirit which they manifest in different spheres of their life, starting from family, civil society and finally in the state. So, our social, political, moral world of human being is the constitutive of this movement of spirit or world spirit or unfolding of a spirit, which constantly realize, and its maturity depends on the society or the community which allow the human being to follow their free will, to use their free reason and not be guided by external authority or norms set by others. So, there is the role of human reason or rationality, but it must realize only in association with others in the family, in the civil society, in the state, according to Hegel. So, according to Hegel, the full realization of human freedom is possible only in the life of state, which is the ultimate realization or maturity or complete maturity of human beings. So, human beings also start from a very immature condition to fullest maturity in the life of a state. So, starting from the family, and we will discuss it more in the second lecture on Hegel, that how human beings constantly actualize himself or herself by living in different domains of life, and his full realization of maturity is possible only in the state while living among the free and equal members. And he therefore saw state as the manifestation of universal will or the God, and he calls it march of God on the earth therefore. So, human beings when lead a free life in the life of a state which allow him and her to realize his own free will, and what is this free will we will discuss later in this lecture. But the basic argument in Hegel is that human being can realize his true freedom or actualize his own self fully in the life of a state, which is the representative of universal will or the spirit of the God in a sense. So, in Hegel you have then this combination of both the, as I said, the romantics and also the Enlightenment tradition in German intellectual tradition. So, one could understand the overwhelming influence of Hegel's philosophy by this fact that the German philosophy was broadly divided into two schools after Hegel's death, that is left Hegelians and right Hegelians. And the left Hegelians saw in Hegel philosophy a great many radical possibilities and provided much more radical revolutionary interpretation of Hegel's work, whereas the right Hegelian saw Hegel as a conservative thinker who defended status quo. So, there is a kind of very opposite interpretation of Hegel's philosophy by these two schools of German philosophy, left Hegelian and right Hegelian. The other point that one needs to understand is the overwhelming influence of Hegel philosophy, where you have to be Hegelian, whether it is right or left, how you interpret it may differ, but nonetheless the influence of Hegel's philosophy is overwhelming in the further development of German philosophical tradition. Now, we will look at the political and the intellectual context of Hegel, which was a kind of full of historical and epoch making possibilities. So, there was a new ways of theorization, thinking about politics, individual freedom, human reason, and how it can help in the progress of mankind or humanity. So, the context, political and the intellectual context of Hegel when he was writing or developing his thought was full of such historical possibilities, where human thought or philosophy had profound influence in shaping the destiny of mankind, in organizing the collective life of the nation, and also thinking about new ways of organizing social and political life. So, it was full of historical and epoch making possibilities, and philosophy in true sense of the term had tremendous influence on politics and historical events. It shaped the destinies of mankind and became the foundation of modern political imagination. So, much of our thinking about state, freedom, human rights or human identity or self consciousness or individual rights is shaped by these philosophical discussions and debates taking place in Germany. It also resulted in the French Revolution, which was in particular epoch making event for the modern sensibilities to emerge. The very foundation of that is the liberty, equality and fraternity, and also a kind of republican ways of organizing collective political life. So, French Revolution, which we have discussed while discussing Rousseau, that much of its idea was derived from Rousseau's political writings, and he shaped the historical epoch making events like French Revolution. And after the French Revolution, there is a kind of new development in or a kind of rediscovery of Rousseau to understand many developments that was taking place after the French Revolution and the motives for that revolution, because the prevalent system or a political system was that of monarchy, and it was considered like the given thing. People themselves cannot really govern, and it leads to many instabilities or a kind of reign of terror and so on. So, there was the divide among the intellectuals when it comes to support or oppose French Revolution, but nonetheless it actually shook the monarchies and dynasties across the Europe, and there was the real danger about the people destabilizing the existing monarchies and dynasties across the Europe. Hegel too was profoundly influenced by the French Revolution and its promises of rule by people and republican values such as liberty, equality and fraternity. And Hegel also saw in Napoleon the manifestation of what he calls the universal will or world spirit. So, it was historically, politically really epoch making context in which Hegel was developing his thought, and particularly his own state, that is Prussia, which was part of Germany, was divided into 300 small kingdoms and principalities. So, the modern Germany is very different from the Germany that Hegel inhabited. It was divided into different principalities, smaller principalities which numbered around 300. And Prussia, which was part of that 300 small kingdoms or principalities, was regarded as the strongest among them and also the most enlightened state. So, much of the political philosophy or development in arts, culture and literature, in music, science and military craft is under the enlightened rule of Frederick in Prussia. However, French under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte sought to reunite Europe through wars and territorial expansions. It defeated Prussia too in the Battle of Jena. And at this time, when this Battle of Jena was taking place between the Kingdom of Prussia and the French army of Napoleon Bonaparte, Hegel was teaching at the University of Jena and was working on his magnum opus called Phenomenology of Spirit. And this is the most influential text of Hegel, which shapes many of his other writings. So, whether it is about his views on freedom, his ideas on state or civil society, or his ideas on philosophy of religion, history and also the history of philosophy, is seen as a kind of movement of a spirit or what he called Geist. So, he was working on this manuscript when Napoleon army was fighting this Battle of Jena, and the defeat of Prussia in the Battle of Jena exposed the military weakness of Prussian kingdom and also led to the demand for the unification of Germany. So, it was also a kind of politically turbulent time, and as we have discussed in other thinkers, Hegel was also responding to those political changes in the real practical world taking place, and at the same time reflecting upon the intellectual discussions and debates, whether it is the romantics or the enlightenment thinkers. So, it was also a magnificent era of greats or many greats in German intellectual tradition. Immanuel Kant and his philosophy provided the sound basis to the enlightenment by rescuing it from the clutches of skeptics or the empiricists. As we have discussed in the previous lectures, that enlightenment tradition was divided into two sharp groups, where one believing in the reason and rationality and subjecting everything to human thought or human inquiry through reason and rationality, were the skeptics. So, they were skeptics or apprehensive about everything given. They want to use human reason, and only those things which convince the human being through their reason is acceptable. In other words, reason and rationality alone is the source of knowledge. Therefore, everything must be subjected to the critical inquiry. So, there were the skeptics. The other was the empiricists, who believed that human beings acquire knowledge about the world through experience. So, there is a kind of tabula rasa. Human being start his life as a blank slate, and only by living in the society, in the community, in the life of nation state, through experiences, human being derives knowledge about the world. So, there is the empiricists and then the skeptics. One is focusing on the reason, rationality, other is focusing on the experiences. We have seen through Kant that how he tried to unite or transcend this contradiction within the enlightenment tradition by establishing the use of reason and rationality, and also acknowledging the role of human sensation or how it leads to perception, and perception requires the role of reason and rationality for a knowledge to be sound. So, all kind of sensation cannot be the basis of true knowledge. True knowledge requires the role or involvement of human reason and intellect. So, we have all kind of sensory experience, but that is not the true basis of our knowledge of the world. We organize it, we refine it, and that organizing and refining of our sensory experience of the world requires the role of human reason and rationality, and therefore Kant tries to in a way unite these two groups within the Enlightenment tradition. And he was also regarded as the founder of German idealism, and Hegel and many other philosophers then argued that the Kant should be the beginning of the philosophy, and then he went on to criticize particularly his views on freedom, which was too abstract according to Hegel. So, German Romanticism had the greatest reflections in Goethe's work, such as literature, art, Beethoven in music, and Schelling, Schiller and Fichte in philosophy. So, thus Germany during the Hegel's period was experiencing profound developments in art, science and philosophy. So, that was both the intellectual and also the political context of Hegel. Now, we come to discuss briefly his own personal life. So, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born in 1770s in Stuttgart, which is in the southwestern province of Germany. His father was a subordinate official in the finance department of the Württemberg estate. So, he started with a very modest living and the moderate thinking or also expectations from the life. So, he was not really a kind of very bright student from the beginning. He gradually developed his thought by combining the prevalent schools of thought led by many other thinkers such as Schelling, Scheler, Fichte in German idealism, and certainly Immanuel Kant. So, after his schooling there in Stuttgart, he went to Tübingen to study philosophy and theology, and he was also profoundly influenced by Greek literature, and he regarded it as a kind of something which should be respected or asserted with pride, that we derive our sense of duty, morality or reason and rationality through Greeks and not through some Eastern religion, as he accused many other states in Europe deriving their inspiration from the Eastern religion, whereas Germany including himself was deriving their inspiration from the Greek literature. So, Greek literature certainly played a very significant role in the development of Hegelian thought and philosophy. So, after the completion of his studies, Hegel worked as a tutor for the wealthy families in Switzerland and also in Frankfurt, and during these years he also developed his essays on religion and theology, and interestingly he never published it during his lifetime. So, when he was working as a tutor to some of the rich families in Bern in Switzerland or in Frankfurt, he was developing his thought on religion and theology, and there is a reason for that. As we have discussed that the critique of Enlightenment thinkers was directed towards religion, because it used to control every sphere of life, from child birth to his death, from the kingdom to dynasties, from family to the community. So, in a sense much of the development was taking place also within the religious reforms or the Protestant ethics that leads to new ways of thinking about human identity, human freedom and organization of collective social and political life. So, Hegel also began his speculation or thinking about political issues or philosophy by criticizing theology and religion, but interestingly he never published it during his lifetime. Considering human freedom as important attributes of human beings, so he regards the freedom, and freedom is a kind of restraint from any external control or subjugation, and that is the basis for all progress. And Hegel also acknowledged that human freedom or the freedom is the important attributes of human beings, and in these essays Hegel combined human freedom with the reason, the rule of reason, such as in Kant or the Kantian ethics, is the combination of both human reason and also the morality or a sense of duty, which is derived by using one's own reason and not being dependent on others, such as religion or society or the community, to tell us what to do and what is good for us. So, you recall the Kantian views on enlightenment. It is coming out of one's self imposed immaturity condition, and immaturity condition is not something which cannot be overcome. Human beings, the majority of them at least according to Kant, lacks the courage to act upon their own will, act upon their own reason, and that is the problem or obstacles in the enlightenment for the society, for the individual. So, he combined human freedom with the reason, such as in Kantian ethics, and also love or compassion, that is the teachings of Jesus. He also compared Christ with the teachings of Socrates on ethics and argued that orthodox religion is a barrier or obstacles in the realization of human freedom and reasons. So, human freedom and reason cannot flourish unless there is denial or subjecting the religious orthodoxy to critical rational inquiry. So, if your ethics or morality is guided by a notion of religion or a kind of orthodoxy or what is prevalent in the society, then you are not really free, you are not really using your own reason. So, he considered the orthodoxy or the orthodox religion as an obstacles in the progress of human freedom and human reason. So, human freedom and reason is realizable in the absence of any external control or subjugation, including the orthodox religion. And during the time when Hegel's and many other philosophers were discussing their ideas and developing their political philosophical argument, the major restraint on such argumentation was coming from the religious orthodoxy or the religious conservatism, who do not allow certain ideas which was seen as destabilizing the status quo or prevalent structure of power in the society. So, Hegel in this text considered orthodox religion as a barrier to the realization of human freedom and reasons, because it subordinates the human beings to the external authority. So, the religious orthodoxy and the values or the ethics that it prescribes is not based on individual self developed human capacity of reason or human will, and therefore, anything that is not based on human on reason or will should not be the basis for his morality and ethics. So, the sense of ethics, morality or duty or obligation must necessarily be based on human on reason or understanding of his own duty. So, these essays are now published as early theological writings, but as I said, it was not published during his lifetime. However, many scholars consider this as a key text to understand Hegel's philosophy. So, that is the beginning or the foundational text to understand other writings of Hegel. He started his professional career as a lecturer at the University of Jena on the recommendation of his friend and contemporary turned rivals in the later years, Schelling. It is at the University of Jena he wrote his magnum opus Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807, and while he was still working on this manuscript, Hegel saw Napoleon's army marching into the city, and after the defeat of Prussia in the Battle of Jena, the university was closed, and then Hegel started to explore newer opportunities. So, after the closure of university, Hegel worked as a newspaper editor in Bamberg for a year, and then became a headmaster of a high school at Nuremberg. And it is surprising to know that as a headmaster of a high school, Hegel continued to work on philosophy. It is highly unlikely to expect in contemporary modern world. So, he worked as the headmaster of a high school for 9 years, and it was in this position that he wrote Logic in 1812, which was a very dense text notorious for its unintelligibility. Nonetheless, it captivated the German speaking world and won him a chair of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg. And it is at the Heidelberg that Hegel wrote Encyclopedia of Philosophical Science 1817. And his reputation by the year 1818 was so great that the Prussian Minister of Education himself asked him to take up a prestigious chair of philosophy at the University of Berlin, which was the very prestigious position among the philosophers in German speaking world. So, since then, that is in the year 1818, when he took up the chair of philosophy at the University of Berlin, until his death in 1831 due to the outbreak of cholera epidemic in Berlin and in the rest of the Europe, Hegel ruled the philosophic world as indisputably as Goethe the world of literature and Beethoven the realm of music. So, he was the undisputable king of the philosophic world. As I said in the beginning of this lecture, there was this overwhelming influence of Hegelian thought and philosophy on the later generation, which was divided into young Hegelians as leftist and the rightist, with the very contradictory interpretation of Hegelian philosophy. So, since his appointment as the chair of philosophy at the University of Berlin in 1818 till his death in 1831, Hegel was the undisputable leader in the philosophic world, like Goethe in the literature or Beethoven in the realm of music. He extensively wrote during this period and gave lectures on the philosophy of history, philosophy of religion, aesthetics, and the history of philosophy. If you look at the major works of Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit 1807, Logic 1812, Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences 1817, The Philosophy of Rights, The Philosophy of History 1821, Philosophy of Religion, and Lectures on Aesthetics, and there are many other compilation of Hegelian work. And among these, only Phenomenology and Logic is said to be written by Hegel himself, and both these texts are very obscure and full of abstract ideas and abstractions. So, it is not easy to read them, and like Kant, you have that problem of abstraction or modification of each sentences and the density that is hard to decipher for the ordinary reader. So, both these texts are notorious for its obscurity and abstraction, but it has abiding influence or profound influence in German speaking world. And as we have discussed with quotation that Hegel became the undisputed leader in the philosophic world, like Goethe was in the world of literature and art, and Beethoven in the realm of music. So, only Phenomenology of a Spirit and the Logic was written by Hegel. Other texts were based on, like Aristotle's, lecture notes taken by his students. So, Aristotle Politics, it is said about that text that many books or chapters of that text is not chronologically arranged. The reason being that it is based on the compilation of the notes taken by his student, not necessarily or organized in a very coherent manner by the author itself. So, similarly, many of the Hegelian work is based on the lecture notes taken by his student. Okay, now we move on to his views on freedom. So, Hegel acknowledges the freedom as the fundamental attributes of human beings. So, all progress, the realization of self or the development of self consciousness is possible only and only through human freedom, or only in a society which permits individual to use his own reason, to express his own will, and then guide his action according to his own reason and own free will. So, there is in Hegel a kind of comparative study of civilization also, where different civilizations are at different stages of maturity. That depends upon how much freedom they allow their individual. So, the society or the civilization gives more freedom to the individual to use their own reason, to express their own will. Their action is a reflection of their own will. That society will be much more mature, much more progressive than the others which limits those freedom and reason. So, he regard freedom as the fundamental attributes of human being. However, he differed substantially from the abstract liberal and the Kantian notion of freedom, and there is a kind of counterintuitive approach to understanding human freedom in Hegel. So, in much of the liberal and the Kantian notions of freedom, certainly Kant is much more abstract, theoretical in a sense that he wants the individual to think for himself that he is free and act accordingly as if he is free, even if there is obstacles and challenges to his freedom. And only when the individual began to first think that he or she is free, then enlightenment can be brought about at the larger scale in the society. Liberal, on the other hand, generally define freedom as the absence of external constraints. So, you are free to the extent that your actions are not controlled or regulated by the external authority. So, Isaiah Berlin, the whole idea of negative freedom is I am free to the extent where I am not interfered with by others or regulated or controlled by others. So, liberals define this freedom as the absence of external constraints or impediments on human action. In other words, freedom is associated with human beings having the option or choice to choose whatever he or she wants or desire. So, the freedom, liberty in the liberal sense of the term means that human beings are free to choose what she or he desires, and freedom means the absence of any constraints, absence of any limits or absence of any control on this exercise of human choice. So, human beings are free or considered to be free to the extent he or she is capable of choosing what she should do and what she should not do, and she or he alone does that. It is not the external authority, not the family, not the parents, not the teachers, not the society, not the state which decide for them what is good. So, the very premise of liberal understanding of freedom is this absence of restraint and a degree of human choice. For Hegel, such understanding of freedom is merely formal or abstract, which does not really express or reflect the genuine freedom or what he calls the substance. And there is this kind of thinking in the writings of Hannah Arendt or to some extent Foucault as well, and many other scholars who argue that freedom is not something which is absence of experiment alone or restraints alone or to be exercised in isolation from the others in the society. So, liberty or freedom is also seen, I am self-defining autonomous subject free to do what I wish to do, and I should be left to do what is self-regarding function. We will discuss it in John Stuart Mill. But this self-centric notion of freedom does not, according to Hegel, gives the human being the true freedom or true expression of his own will, which is possible to actualize or realize only in association with the others. In the family, in the civil society, in the sphere of the state, when individual guided by their own reason or their own exercise of free will acknowledge the existence of others and in association with others realize or develop his own self consciousness. So, the true freedom or the realization of true freedom is possible only in the association with others, not in the absence of others. So, in Hegel's you have a very counterintuitive understanding of freedom or the substantial notion of freedom which acknowledge and recognize the existence of others. So, Hegel argued that such notions or the liberal notions of freedom do not truly represent the human free will, and he gives will a very specific meaning that is very different from reason and rationality alone. It combines both the reason and rationality with human passion and desire. So, there is a kind of ethical turn also in Hegelian philosophy. So, he argued that such notions of freedom as the absence of external experiment is not something that truly represent the human free will or right or even ethical living. If freedom is taken to begin with choices of the individual in isolation from everything else such as family, community or state, then according to Hegel such exercise of freedom could not be regarded as the free will. So, the will is not just being guided by your desire and passion to do anything that you want to do. It must be subjected to your own reason and a kind of taking aback. So, you desire something, you must recognize that, must acknowledge that, but then also use your reason whether that is doable or not in the given context. So, there is a kind of both the acknowledgement of personal goal or desire or the motives, but then it must be subjected to one's own reason and rationality to know whether that is doable or not, should be done or not, the consequences of it. So, in a kind of practical aspect to the realization of freedom, not merely the abstract understanding of being free to do whatever one wants to do. So, that practical aspect will come only when human realize that freedom or strive for the realization of such freedom in association with others in the life of family, community or state. So, he was equally critical of Hobbesian notion of freedom, which argued that freedom is the relentless pursuit of endless human desires. So, if you recall our lecture on Hobbes, so basically he defines human being as the self guided mechanism of desire and aversion. Desire is something to which human beings constantly try to fulfill, and aversion is something which he wants to avoid. So, anything that gives satisfaction, fulfills his desire, leads to happiness, and anything that is a threat to the realization of his desire is seen as aversion. He or she wants to avoid that. And freedom for Hobbes is then the absence of any kind of external experiment in the human being's pursuit of relentless desire, and in fact he regards life as the endless desire. Human being as a self driven subject has desires, and this is the desire that makes human life worth living for, and the life is to constantly pursue those desires, and there should not be any limit to human desires. So, in a sense that, or at least have the maximum sphere or freedom to realize one's desire. Hegel also critique such understanding of freedom as the relentless pursuit of human desires or passion. So, in contrast to the liberal conception of freedom, Hegel argued that individual freedom is realizable only in the embodiment of other. And this is the very premise of Hegelian philosophy, that self actualization or the self realization requires the presence of other. So, also the freedom and its realization is possible in the embodiment of others. So, I am free to the extent I realize my own self in others. So, thus the freedom for Hegel is being at home, your own true self or guided by your own will with oneself in one's other. So, the dialectics of self and the other, in a sense the opposite, is the necessary event to realize one's own freedom, realize one's own consciousness, realize one's own free will. So, he defines freedom as something which is being at home with oneself in one's other. So, his conception of freedom is thus based on his philosophy of spirit, Geist, and its constant unfolding in the history through what he calls the struggles of opposites. So, it is also known as Hegelian dialectics, and for him human history, which is the history of progress. So, there is the constant stage of realization of maturity, and full realization of such maturity is possible only in the life of a state. So, human history in that sense is also this forward movement towards this realization of progress or maturity, which is the result of this struggle between the opposites and their transcendence. So, Hegelian dialectics basically means that there is constant struggle of opposites, and this struggle constitute a reality or a phenomena or even a human subject. So, how you get to know your own self? By comparing yourself with others, or by differentiating yourself with others. So, the comparison and differentiation of the self from the others requires the presence of others, and it is by differentiating yourself with others you get to know your own self better. So, therefore, in Hegelian philosophy, the understanding of the self, the understanding of the reality requires one to understand the opposites and the relationship with the opposites, the struggles that is the opposites. What constitutes the self is then the transcendence of that opposite. So, the human beings constantly achieve the higher stage of maturity by differentiating oneself with the others and then transcending that self, refining his own self, using his own reason and free will by differentiating with others, and then constantly try to pursue higher stages of life, higher stages of maturity and higher stages of progress. Similar is the case with the society, community and the state or even civilization, where the reality is the contradiction of opposites. So, there would be a very profound thesis, there would be the simultaneous presence of the antithesis of that profound thesis, and the contradiction between the two lead to the next stage of human progress or civilizational development, which he called synthesis. Similar is the case with the human freedom. It is actually possible to realize human freedom in association with others, in the sphere of family, in the sphere of civil society, or finally in the sphere of the state. So, Hegelian dialectics, that is the thesis, antithesis and the synthesis, is based on the idea that the best way to understand the reality or the true nature of a phenomena is to methodologically approach it with its opposites. Always think of a phenomena with its opposites. So, there is a kind of relative terms, nothing is the absolute and abstract in isolation from everything else, everything is interconnected. And in Hegelian philosophy, as I have said, both the animate and inanimate subject is the manifestation of the Geist or the universal world spirit. So, Hegelian methodology is to approach a phenomena or reality by looking at its opposites. Thus, reality and phenomena according to Hegel are constituted by both its contradictions, that is the opposites. So, the self and the other, both are not same and yet mutually interconnected by providing meaning to each other. So, by differentiating yourself with others, you get to know your own self. Similarly is the case with the others. So, the self and other is then mutually interconnected, and yet you realize yourself by transcending that interconnections between self and the other. So, it is true with the reality and every phenomena on earth, which is constituted by both the contradictions of the opposites and resolution of these contradictions, that is the transcendence of those contradictions, which leads to the next stage of individual maturity, realization of his freedom or rationality, and also the development and the progress of society. So, it also defines the true nature of a phenomena, that is every phenomena, every reality tries to reach to the next stage by transcending the opposites, the contradictions between the opposites. So, to understand the Hegelian notion of freedom, then it is necessary to understand his conception of a spirit or Geist, and he characterized it into different historical stages. So, the spirit is something that motivates everything, and it moves everything to act according to certain manners in certain forms, depending upon both the particular context and also the urge, inbuilt urge in the subject to realize the higher stages of development. So, he characterized this spirit into different historical stages, and start with human agency, with capable of willing and acting according to their own free will. So, the movement of universal spirit or Geist is first based on the individual human agency, which is capable of willing and acting. So, not just in thinking, not just in the rational abstract sense, but in the actual practical situation, when the human beings are driven by his own will and courage to act according to that free will. So, that is the first stage. So, human subject must be willing or capable of acting according to his or her own free will. That is the first stage, and this is not a kind of final or absolute realization. It is realized only through the course of association with others at different stages of life, and this is the conditions of constantly striving for the realization of greater and greater freedom. That is not something you realize once for all in a particular given circumstances. So, the movement of a spirit requires first the individual to be capable of having the sense of self agency, which is willing to act according to one's own free will. Then a spirit of human collectivity in a particular historical political context, which he also called Zeitgeist, that is the spirit of the age. So, the individual spirit must combine or interact with the spirit of its age, that is the collective body of human beings, and what is the spirit or what is the spirit of that collective being or that civilization or that community. So, there is this difference between the individual human agency and then the spirit of that is that the larger groups of humanity or the society in a particular historical context, that context also embodies certain spirit, and the individual subject must interact, associate with that historical political context, which he called Zeitgeist. And finally, God or the ultimate or full realization of human freedom or will, and it is possible according to Hegel only in a state. So, state represents the highest stage of development or the highest stage of human freedom or actualization of his her free will. So, the human life, and through human life also the universal or the world spirit manifests itself in the realm of family, civil society, and finally in the state, which is the culmination of the human realization or the full or the final stage of human realization according to Hegel. So, thus for Hegel, human history is in a way movement or unfolding of this spirit or Geist. He also called it world spirit. So, according to him, different civilizations are at different levels of maturity depending upon their culture that gives freedom to individuals to realize their own free will. So, he makes a comparison between Asian civilization, European civilization, Greek civilization and Roman civilization, and then depending upon how these civilization provide the condition to its member to use their own freedom or free will, the progress of that civilization or the maturity of that civilization is in proportion to that freedom which they allow to its own members, and he saw human history as a history of progress or as a realization of greater development of mankind or maturity of human being. Hegel considered his own age and more importantly his own philosophy as the highest stage of human civilization or human knowledge or human freedom, although how far it is true is debatable, certainly when we think about the global institutions or organizations or life beyond the realm of nation state and so on. So, there is this a debate about Hegel's argument that the state is the final culmination or the highest stage of civilization, and his own philosophy, his own is, as you know, the final stage of human maturity, which knew what is worth knowing for and so on. So, one could debate that, but nonetheless in Hegelian argument what you have is that freedom requires the presence of other, and it is in association with the others that the higher stage of realization or maturity can be achieved by individual subject willing to act according to their own free will. In the absence of others, like liberals argue, freedom is not true freedom or genuine freedom, and it is not similar to say Kantian ethics or Hobbesian ideas, which is in Kantian sense a kind of abstract theoretical understanding, or in Hobbesian sense is the constant relentless pursuit of human desires. Hegel gives it much more ethical, practical context. Now, Hegel argued that human will is the free and the practical or active part of the spirit. So, thinking alone is not enough, unless that thinking or that will is guided by the practical and the active part of the spirit. So, you must act according to those will or the spirit which you embodies. So, the realization of which requires the presence of others, thus the freedom manifests itself in every sphere of human endeavors, social life, morality, politics, science, art, religion, and above all in the philosophy. So, every sphere of human life is guided by these manifestations of human freedom, the degree of which can be assessed on the basis of whether that society or that community gives it individual free condition to express his will as they see it, rather than the society guiding the human spirit or the expression of that spirit. Thus, according to Hegel, the will is free when its ends are its own. That means, the motives, the goals of human actions are his own or her own, not given by society or community. So, the will is said to be free only when the ends of the will, what is the desire or the motives of human actions are his own and not of the society, so that it is self determining. So, only in that context when your actions are driven by your own self motives or self set goals, then only your actions are self determining, or you claim to have a kind of self determining life or free life. The will is self determining in turn when two conditions are satisfied. Now, there is the kind of catch in Hegelian dialectics or Hegelian sense of opposites. So, you are free, that does not mean you are driven by your desires and you govern your action according to the desires and the goals that you set for yourself. You have to combine it with the objective, free, rational will also. So, the will is self determining, the will is the human will, and that is very different from human reason, rationality and thinking alone. It is a kind of combination of both, the reason and rationality and human desire and passion which governs one action. So, this will as self determining when it meets two conditions, one is the subjective and the other is the objective. So, one subjective and the other objective, The subjective conditions requires that the will reflect its ends and endorses them on the basis of its given desires and goal. So, as a subjective human being, you know yourself, what is your desires, what are your goals, what are your motives. The objective condition requires that we will pursue ends and goals that are rational. So, that is a kind of practical aspect to that subjective will. So, as a human being, you have your desires, you have your motives, you have your plans, you have your goals, but your will be free will, not only if you are guided by the subjective desires alone, only when you combine with the objective will that requires you to take a kind of back stage and then think for yourself whether it is doable or not, whether it is practicable or not, whether you should do it or not. That requires the use of reason and rationality. So, the objective condition required that the will pursue those ends or those motives or those goals which are rational, that means which can be doable, which leads to greater freedom or higher stage of maturity and development for self and the society. So, then the free will according to Hegel is the mixture of both the subjective and the objective will. Subjective will, you realize what you desire, objective will requires you to use your reason to guide your action, whether that will or that desire is worth pursuing for or not. So, there is a kind of practical aspect to it. So, thus the freedom of man as regards to natural impulses consists not in his being rid of such impulses altogether and thus striving to escape from his nature, but in his recognition of them as a necessary and as something rational. So, the human freedom and realization is not to do away with desires and passions and so on, but to acknowledge those desires or passion and not losing the capacity to transcend those, to achieve the higher stage of life. And when we will discuss this movement of human beings or unfolding of a spirit in human beings from the life in the family to the civil society and finally in the state, we will see that how the materialization of different aspects of human will is possible in different stages of life alone, and why there is the need for family, civil society and state. So, thus in Hegel what you have is not merely the abstract thinking or theorization about the freedom, but also acknowledgement of the desires and the passions and then subjecting them to the reason and rationality to realize oneself. So, he is not looking for the escape route or completely doing away with those desires to live a moral, aesthetic, that kind of argument, but it is a kind of recognition of those impulses and transcending them. So, the particular is as important as the general or the abstract. So, thus freedom for Hegel is not something merely abstract or formal, but it must have some particular ends and motives. So, these ends and motives of human beings are absolutely critical for the realization of human will. So, in the absence of that, it would be a kind of Kantian categorical imperative which according to Hegel was the hollow freedom. It is the lack of all kind of freedom. So, human being progressively realize his freedom in different sphere of life, in the life of family, civil society and state. So, realization of which requires the presence of other as we have discussed, and it is in contrast to others that human beings become fully conscious of their own self, desires and motives. So, what you think about your own self, what is your own motives and desires, you get to know when you differentiate or relate it with others. So, the presence of other is absolutely critical to know your own self, to become self conscious, to develop your own plans and motives. And its full or progressive realization is possible through living an ethical life in association with others in family, civil society and finally in the state, and the state provides you the ultimate condition to realize your full freedom or full human reason. We will discuss a part of it when we start our discussion on Hegel's views on family, civil society and state in the next lecture, but that is all for today's lecture on Hegel's political intellectual context and also his personal life and his views on freedom. For this lecture you can refer to some of these texts like Weiser Frederick, The Cambridge Companion to Hegel, David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to the Present. You should refer to Will Durant, The Story of Philosophy. While discussing on Kant, he has a part of that chapter devoted to Hegel's and his contribution. You can also refer to Psephologia, Western Political Thought from the Ancient Greeks to Modern Times. James Allen Wren also give you a very good introduction to Hegelian philosophy and thought. You must read this Peter Singer, Hegel, a very short introduction, published from Oxford University Press 2002, and certainly Charles Taylor, Hegel, Cambridge University Press 1977. So, these are some of the texts you can refer to understand more about the themes that we have discussed in this lecture. So, that is all in today's lecture. Do share your views and comments. We will be happy to hear and respond to them. Thanks for listening. Thank you all.